October 3rd, 2024, 7:04 a.m. The Langford Grand Hotel, Chicago. The dark metallic sedan rolled to a precise and almost silent stop beneath the towering glass canopy. And the man who stepped out carried the kind of controlled stillness that didn't demand attention, yet commanded it anyway. His posture straight, his movements deliberate, his expression neutral in a way that suggested not calm but calculation, as if everything around him had already been analyzed and reduced into something manageable long before he arrived. His name was Dominic Hale, 34 years old, CEO of Hale Maritime Systems, a global logistics empire quietly valued at over $2.5 billion, operating across continents with contracts that rarely made headlines but moved industries. And in his hand, he carried a slim black folder containing a 362-page agreement that would either elevate his company into a new tier of influence or bind it to something far more complicated, though the weight he felt had little to do with paper and far more to do with something he refused to name, because naming it would mean acknowledging doubt, and doubt was something he had trained himself to eliminate entirely. 15 miles away, in a cramped second floor apartment above a convenience store in South Chicago, at exactly 5:18 a.m., Elena Brooks turned off her alarm before it could ring a second time, her body already conditioned to wake before sound, because sound meant urgency, and urgency meant another day of calculations. She could never quite escape. She sat up slowly, staring at the ceiling that had begun to peel in one corner, mentally organizing her day the way she always did, counting hours, shifts, tips, expenses, because her life depended on structure in a way that left no space for error. Her job at a waterfront restaurant barely covered rent and bills. Her student loan of $34,600 still lingered from a language and culinary program she had never completed. Yet she refused to let go of the one thing that still felt like it belonged to her. The worn notebook beside her bed, filled with French translations, phrases, and annotations. Something she carried everywhere, not because it was useful in her current life, but because it reminded her of the life she had once imagined. That day felt ordinary, predictable in the way most days had become, and that was exactly why she didn't recognize it as the beginning of something that would slowly, quietly, and completely change everything. Dominic entered the restaurant at exactly 12:16 p.m., taking a seat by the window overlooking the river, accompanied by a man who spoke with the kind of easy confidence that felt rehearsed rather than earned, introducing himself as Victor Lang, a legal consultant whose tone carried a polished smoothness that rarely invited questions. While Dominic remained quieter, his speech measured, his English precise but slightly restrained, as if each sentence passed through an internal filter before being released, and when the contract was opened between them, its pages filled with dense French legal text, Victor leaned forward and began translating casually, almost dismissively, as if nothing within the document required deep attention. Elena approached their table with menus, her movements automatic, her expression neutral, until her eyes caught a brief glimpse of the contract, and something inside her reacted instantly, not intentionally, but reflexively, because language had always worked that way for her, processing itself before she could decide whether she wanted it to or not, and she heard Victor say, "This clause is just standard protection," while her eyes read something entirely different. Transferred complet des droits irrévocables. Full irreversible transfer of rights, not protection. Transfer. Permanent. She didn't stop, didn't react, didn't speak. She simply continued walking, because that was what she had always done: remain unnoticed, avoid involvement, protect herself by staying outside of situations that didn't belong to her. But that night, lying in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling as the city moved quietly outside, the words refused to leave her mind, repeating themselves in a way that felt impossible to ignore because somewhere deep inside her memory, her mother's voice echoed, reminding her that words were never neutral, that when someone changed them, they were changing truth itself. And the more she thought about it, the more impossible it became to dismiss. The next evening, he returned alone this time, sitting at the same table, the same position, the same stillness. But something had shifted, something subtle but real, as if doubt had already begun to settle beneath his controlled exterior. And when he muttered something quietly in French about the coffee, Elena responded without thinking. The coffee is the only honest thing here. He looked up immediately, not casually, not politely, but sharply, as if something unexpected had just entered his world. You understand French? He asked. I studied it, she replied. That moment was small, almost insignificant on the surface, but it was enough to shift everything. Not trust, but enough. She told him about the clause carefully, without accusation, explaining what it actually meant, what it implied, what it could lead to, and he resisted, not because he didn't hear her, but because accepting her words meant accepting that something was wrong, and that meant admitting he had overlooked something important, something that could cost him everything. But doubt had already begun, and doubt doesn't leave once it enters. That night he returned again, not as a customer, but as someone searching for clarity. Show me, he said, and she did. Over the next several days, what began as a brief conversation turned into something deeper, something structured, as they worked through the contract line by line, uncovering inconsistencies too precise to be accidental. Numbers adjusted just enough to pass unnoticed, clauses rewritten in ways that shifted control gradually, silently, until the entire document revealed itself as something far more dangerous than it appeared. It wasn't flawed, it was engineered, a calculated takeover hidden inside language, a silent shift of power disguised as cooperation. Dominic began to change, not dramatically, but in small ways, asking more questions, listening longer, allowing uncertainty to exist without immediately rejecting it, while Elena, for the first time in her life, began to see herself differently, not as someone trapped in a small life, but as someone who possessed something valuable, something others had missed entirely. By the final night, the truth was undeniable. The contract wasn't a mistake. It was a plan, carefully designed, precisely executed, hidden behind trust and language. And in that moment, everything made sense. The urgency, the pressure, the confidence of the people, pushing the deal forward because they believed he wouldn't understand. The next morning, in a boardroom filled with executives, lawyers, and investors, the illusion collapsed, not through confrontation or chaos, but through clarity, as Elena presented each detail, each clause, each manipulation, laying the truth out piece by piece until there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend, nothing left but reality. The deal ended. The deception was exposed, and Dominic finally understood something he had never allowed himself to accept before. Control isn't about knowing everything, it's about knowing when to listen. But the story didn't end there, because what followed mattered far more than the contract ever did. And for the first time in years, Dominic found himself sitting alone in his office late at night, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass walls, reflecting against the polished surfaces of a space designed to project power, yet feeling strangely empty in a way he hadn't noticed before. Because for years his life had been defined by movement, by progress, by constant forward motion that left no room for stillness. And now that everything had slowed, even briefly, he realized how little space he had allowed for anything that wasn't control. Elena, meanwhile, returned to her routine, but it didn't feel the same anymore. The cafe looked smaller somehow, the conversations around her more distant. The repetition of orders and polite smiles no longer felt like something she could disappear into. Because once you see your value, even for a moment, it becomes impossible to unsee it. And that realization followed her through every shift, every late night, every quiet moment when she would open her notebook and run her fingers over the pages, filled with words that once felt like fragments of a life she had lost, but now felt like something entirely different, something unfinished, something waiting. Days turned into weeks, and though neither of them reached out immediately, the connection between them didn't disappear. It remained quietly present, not as something emotional or dramatic, but as something grounded in recognition, the kind that doesn't fade easily because it's built on truth rather than illusion. And when Dominic finally walked back into the restaurant one evening, there was no hesitation this time, no distance, just a simple understanding that something between them had already changed. "I've been thinking," he said, sitting across from her, his tone calmer, less guarded. "That's new," she replied lightly, though there was no mockery in her voice. "It is," he admitted, and for the first time there was something almost unfamiliar in his expression, something closer to honesty than control. "And I don't think you should be here." She looked around the restaurant, then back at him. "And where exactly should I be?" "With me," he said simply. The offer wasn't elaborate, wasn't wrapped in promises or persuasion. It was direct, clear, the way he approached everything, but this time there was something different beneath it. Not control, not expectation, but recognition, and that made it harder to dismiss. She didn't answer immediately because for the first time in her life, she wasn't reacting to circumstances. She wasn't making decisions out of necessity or pressure. She was choosing, truly choosing. And that kind of choice requires silence before it requires action. "What would I do?" she asked finally. "What you already did," he said. "See what others miss." And in that moment, something settled inside her. Something quiet but certain, the kind of realization that doesn't arrive loudly but changes everything once it does. And she understood that this wasn't about leaving the cafe or escaping her current life or stepping into something bigger. It was about stepping into something that had always been hers but had remained hidden beneath everything she thought she lacked. She closed her notebook slowly. "Okay," she said. And just like that, without drama, without spectacle, her life shifted in a way that no longer felt temporary, no longer felt uncertain, because it wasn't built on chance or luck. It was built on something far more solid, understanding. And once you have that, everything else follows. She closed her notebook slowly. "Okay," she said. And just like that, without noise, without hesitation, something shifted permanently. The next few days didn't feel dramatic, and that was what made them real. There were no sudden transformations, no instant changes in her surroundings, no immediate escape from the life she had been living, because real change rarely arrives in visible ways. Instead, it began quietly, almost invisibly, in the way she started observing things differently, the way she spoke less but thought more, the way she noticed details she had previously ignored because they hadn't seemed important enough to matter. Dominic didn't rush her. That was the first thing she noticed. A man like him, someone who built billion-dollar decisions in hours, didn't try to control the pace this time. He didn't call repeatedly, didn't push, didn't turn the offer into pressure. He simply gave her space, and in that space, something deeper formed: trust. Not the fragile kind, the kind built slowly, carefully, from consistency. 3 days later, she stood outside a glass building in downtown Chicago, her reflection staring back at her from the polished surface, looking both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. She adjusted her jacket slightly, not because it needed adjustment, but because her hands needed something to do, something to steady the quiet tension that had settled inside her. She wasn't nervous, not exactly, but she was aware. Aware that this was a moment that didn't come often, aware that stepping inside meant stepping into something that would not be easy to leave. And for a second, just 1 second, she almost turned around. But then she remembered something, the contract. The way she had seen what others had missed, the way Dominic had listened, and more importantly, the way she had felt when she realized she was right. Not lucky, not accidental. Right. That was enough. She walked in. The reception area was quiet, controlled, designed with the kind of minimal elegance that suggested power without displaying it openly. People moved with purpose, conversations were low, precise, efficient, and no one wasted time looking at things that didn't concern them. She fit in, not because she looked like them, but because she understood something they valued: clarity. Dominic was waiting upstairs, not in a boardroom, not behind a desk, but near the window, looking out over the city, as if he needed to see something beyond it to think clearly. "You came," he said, without turning immediately. "I said I would." He nodded slightly, then turned toward her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because some things don't need immediate words. "You understand what this means?" he asked finally. "Yes," she said. And I'm not here because of the job." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "Then why are you here?" She stepped closer, placing her notebook on the table between them. "Because I want to know how deep this goes." That was the moment everything truly began. Not the offer, not the contract, not the deal, but the decision to step into something unknown, without fear controlling the outcome. Dominic studied her for a moment longer than usual, as if recalibrating something in his mind, adjusting the way he had initially categorized her, because until now she had existed as an exception, someone who appeared unexpectedly and solved a problem. But in that moment, she became something else, a variable, one he couldn't predict. "Good," he said quietly. And for the first time, there was something close to respect in his voice that didn't feel controlled. Over the next week, her world expanded in ways that didn't feel overwhelming, but precise, like stepping into a system that had been running long before she arrived, one that required understanding rather than adaptation. She didn't receive a title immediately. She didn't need one. What she was given instead was access, documents, contracts, communications, layers of information that most people never saw. And slowly, carefully, she began doing what she had always done: seeing patterns, inconsistencies, small details that didn't align, not mistakes, never mistakes, intentional shifts. And the more she looked, the clearer it became. The contract they had stopped wasn't isolated, it was part of something larger, much larger. A network of agreements structured in similar ways. Different companies, different locations, same pattern, same method. Someone wasn't just targeting Dominic, someone was building something, quietly, systematically, and they had been doing it for a long time. The realization didn't come all at once. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece, like a structure revealing itself only when you step back far enough to see the full shape. When she finally placed the last document down, the room felt quieter than usual. Not because there was less noise, but because something had shifted. "This wasn't just about your company," she said. Dominic didn't respond immediately. He already knew. He had been arriving at the same conclusion. "Then what is it?" he asked. She looked at him directly. "Control." And in that moment, everything aligned. Control. And once the word settled between them, it didn't feel like a theory anymore. It felt like something real, something already in motion, long before either of them became aware of it. Dominic leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting away from her and toward the city beyond the glass. But he wasn't really looking at the skyline anymore. He was calculating, reconstructing, replaying every decision he had made over the past year, every deal he had approved, every advisor he had trusted. "Show me," he said quietly. Elena didn't rush. That had become her strength without her even realizing it. She gathered the documents slowly, spreading them across the table in a way that made the pattern visible, not just in words but in structure. Dates aligned too closely, clauses repeated with slight variations. Legal language adjusted just enough to avoid detection while still carrying the same intent. This one, she pointed to a contract from 6 months ago, looks normal if you read it once, but if you compare it to this, she slid another file forward, you'll see the same transfer. Condition hidden under a different phrase. Dominic's eyes narrowed slightly. And this one? He asked. Same thing, different region, different company. Same outcome. Silence followed. Not empty silence, heavy silence, the kind that comes when something undeniable takes shape. How many? He asked. Elena didn't answer immediately. She flipped through her notes, then looked up. At least 9 that I can confirm, probably more. Dominic exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening just enough to reveal what he wasn't saying out loud. This wasn't an isolated attack. This wasn't even about him anymore. This was a system. Someone had been building something quietly, carefully, and efficiently, using trust as the entry point and language as the weapon. Who? He asked. Elena shook her head slightly. Not yet, but whoever it is, they don't make mistakes. That was the part that stayed with him. No mistakes, because Dominic understood something very clearly. When something looks perfect, it usually means it was designed that way. And anything designed that precisely has a creator who doesn't plan to fail. Over the next few days, everything accelerated, not in chaos, in precision. Dominic didn't panic. He didn't confront anyone. He didn't alert his team. Instead, he did what he had always done best. He created space to observe. Meetings were delayed, decisions were paused, communication was filtered. And quietly, without drawing attention, he began testing the people around him. Small changes, subtle shifts, different versions of the same information shared with different individuals. And Elena watched. That became her role. Not officially, not publicly, but critically. She observed reactions, patterns, timing, who responded too quickly, who didn't question changes, who seemed too prepared. And slowly the circle began to narrow. It didn't happen in one moment. It never does. It revealed itself through behavior, consistency, absence of doubt where doubt should exist. And finally, one name stood out: Marcus Delaney, senior strategic advisor, 8 years with the company, trusted, respected, untouchable, or at least he had been. Dominic didn't react when the realization formed. That was the difference between someone emotional and someone dangerous. He stayed still, because stillness hides intention. What do we do? Elena asked quietly. Dominic looked at her, not with uncertainty, but with clarity. We let him continue. She frowned slightly. Why? Because if we stop him now, Dominic said calmly, we only expose one piece. I want the whole structure. Elena didn't respond immediately, because she understood. This wasn't about defense anymore. This was about exposure, and exposure required patience. The next week was the most controlled period of silence either of them had ever experienced. Nothing obvious changed. Meetings continued, contracts moved, decisions were made, but beneath all of it, something was building. Marcus didn't know he was being watched. That was the advantage. He continued operating exactly as he had before, carefully, confidently, too confidently. And that was his mistake, because confidence without awareness becomes predictable, and predictable becomes traceable. It was late one evening when Elena noticed it. Not a big move, not something obvious. A small adjustment in a document timestamp. But the timing didn't align. It connected to something else. A communication delay, a secondary file access, and suddenly, the entire structure clicked into place. This is it, she said quietly, pushing the file toward Dominic. He read it once, then again, and this time there was no doubt. It wasn't just Marcus. He was a gate, not the source, not the architect, a connection. And through him, everything else became visible. Dominic closed the file slowly. Tomorrow, he said. Elena looked at him. What happens tomorrow? He stood up, straightening his jacket with the same calm precision he always carried. Everything ends. The boardroom the next morning felt different. Not tense, not loud, but controlled in a way that made people uncomfortable without understanding why. Executives sat in their usual positions. Documents were placed. Conversations began. Marcus entered last, confident, relaxed, unaware. Dominic waited until everyone was seated. Then he spoke. Before we begin, I'd like to review something. His tone was calm, neutral, but final. Marcus smiled slightly. Of course. Elena remained silent, seated slightly behind, her presence still unofficial, but no longer unnoticed. Dominic placed a single file in the center of the table. This, he said, is where it started. Marcus leaned forward, still calm, still confident, but something in his eyes shifted, just slightly, and that was enough. Because in that moment, Dominic knew, not from evidence, not from proof, from reaction. And once you see that reaction, you can't unsee it. This wasn't a mistake, Dominic continued, and neither were the 8 that followed. The room went silent. No one moved, no one spoke, because something had just changed. Completely. Marcus leaned back slowly, still composed, still controlled, but not untouched. You're making a serious accusation, he said. Dominic nodded slightly. No, he replied. I'm making a complete one. And as Elena watched the room shift, watched the illusion break, watched the system collapse in real time, she realized something that went far beyond contracts, beyond language, beyond business. This had never been about intelligence alone. It had been about awareness, about seeing what others ignore, about understanding what others overlook, and most importantly, about knowing exactly when to act. Because timing was everything, and in that room at that exact moment, Dominic had chosen it perfectly. No one spoke for several seconds after his last sentence, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but loaded, as if every person present understood that something irreversible had just begun, and even those who didn't fully grasp the situation could feel the shift, the invisible line that had just been crossed. Marcus didn't deny it immediately. That was the first confirmation. A man in his position, falsely accused, would react fast, defensively, aggressively, even. But Marcus didn't. He measured the room instead, his eyes moving subtly across the table, calculating, adjusting, searching for an angle that no longer existed. You've misunderstood something, he finally said, his tone still controlled, still composed, but no longer effortless. Dominic didn't interrupt, he let him speak. Because sometimes letting someone continue is the fastest way to expose them. Elaborate, Dominic said calmly. Marcus leaned forward slightly, placing his hands on the table as if grounding himself in the familiar posture of authority. These agreements are complex, regional variations, legal structures, translation differences. They're not differences, Elena said quietly. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. But every head in the room turned toward her. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. Marcus's eyes shifted to her, and for a brief moment, something real appeared beneath his composure. Recognition, and something else, concern. You're basing this on interpretation, he replied, dismissive but not fully convincing. No, Elena said, her voice steady. I'm basing this on consistency. She stood slowly, not out of defiance, but out of clarity, and walked toward the table, placing another set of documents beside Dominic's file. Different regions, different companies, same structure, same outcome, same trigger clause hidden under different wording. Marcus didn't respond this time. Because he couldn't, because the pattern was no longer something that could be explained away. Dominic watched him closely, not with anger, not with emotion, but with a level of attention that made escape impossible. You weren't the architect, Dominic said quietly. It wasn't a question. Marcus exhaled slowly. That was the second confirmation. Then who is? Someone at the far end of the table asked, their voice breaking the silence, but not the tension. Marcus didn't answer immediately, because now the calculation had changed. This wasn't about maintaining control anymore. It was about damage. How far does it go? Dominic continued. Marcus leaned back, his posture no longer relaxed, his confidence no longer intact. Far enough, he said. And in those two words, everything expanded. This wasn't just a breach, it wasn't just a network. It was something built over time, across systems, through trust, through language, through access that had been granted without suspicion. Dominic closed the file slowly. Security will handle the rest, he said. No shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just finality. Two men entered quietly moments later, and Marcus didn't resist. Because resistance only matters when there's a chance of escape, and there wasn't. As he stood, his eyes moved once more across the room, briefly stopping on Elena. Not with anger, not even with blame, but with something almost analytical, as if he was trying to understand where the system had failed, and then he was gone. The room remained silent for several seconds after the door closed, because removing a person doesn't remove the impact they leave behind. What now? One of the executives asked. Dominic didn't answer immediately. He looked at Elena instead, because for the first time in that room, he wasn't the only one who understood the full picture. It doesn't stop here, she said quietly. No, Dominic agreed. And if he wasn't the architect, he was just access, Dominic finished. And that meant something much larger still existed. But this time, they weren't blind to it. The following days didn't feel like chaos. They felt controlled, targeted. Investigations began quietly, internally first, then extending outward, tracing connections, communications, agreements that now carried a different meaning under scrutiny. What once looked like business now looked like strategy. What once looked like structure now looked like manipulation. And slowly, carefully, the larger shape began to emerge. Not a single person, not even a single company. A system, built across industries, using the same method: acquire influence quietly, transfer control slowly, remain invisible until it was too late. But this time, it wasn't, because one person had noticed, one detail, one word, one clause that didn't align, and that had been enough. Late one evening, long after most of the office had emptied, Elena stood by the same glass window Dominic had stood at days before, the city stretching endlessly below, lights scattered like something alive, something always moving, always shifting. You changed everything, Dominic said from behind her. She didn't turn immediately. No, she replied softly. I just saw something. That's exactly what changed everything, he said. She turned slightly then, meeting his gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because this wasn't about the contract anymore, or Marcus, or even the system. It was about something much simpler: recognition. You knew what you were doing, he continued. No, she said honestly. I just didn't ignore it. And that was the difference. Not intelligence, not power, not position, attention, and the choice to act on it. Dominic nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. You understand this world now, he said. She looked back at the city. No, she said quietly. I understand how it works. And that was enough, because understanding gives you something far more dangerous than power. It gives you control, real control, the kind that doesn't need to be shown. Weeks later, the office felt different, not because people had changed, but because awareness had. Processes were tighter, decisions slower, trust no longer automatic. And in the middle of it all, Elena moved through it differently than she had before. Not as someone trying to belong, but as someone who already did. Her desk remained simple, her notebook still with her. But now it wasn't a reminder of something lost. It was a tool, something active, something real. Dominic passed by one afternoon, pausing briefly. Any new patterns? He asked. She looked up, a faint, almost knowing expression crossing her face. Not yet, she said. Then, after a second, but they're there. He nodded, because now he understood something he hadn't before. The system didn't end, it adapted, just like the people inside it. But now they were ready, and that was the real ending. Not the exposure, not the collapse, not the victory, but the shift. The moment when someone who had once been invisible became the one who saw everything. And once you become that person, you don't go back, ever.